I work as a truck driver, and this happened to me a few years ago on a highway in Oklahoma. It was late at night, probably around 2 a.m., and I was driving back from a delivery out in Texas. I had a route that took me through some pretty isolated areas, and I was exhausted. If you've ever driven long distances, you know how it can get when you're tired and all you want is to make it home. It was a normal drive at first. Pitch black, barely any cars on the road, just the low hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. The highway I was on was State Highway 9, which runs between Norman and Seminole, for those familiar with the area. It's pretty desolate, mostly surrounded by farmland and the occasional gas station, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was zoning out a bit, just focusing on keeping myself awake. You get used to the rhythm of driving long haul like this, and I knew I'd be home in a few hours if I kept up the pace. The radio was playing something soft in the background, and my eyes kept flicking to the GPS to make sure I was on track. Everything seemed fine, and I didn't have a reason to suspect anything would go wrong. As I drove, I noticed that the road started to feel a little rougher than usual. At first, I chalked it up to poor maintenance. Highways in rural areas can get pretty beat up, and it wasn't uncommon to hit patches of road that hadn't been repaved in years. The bumps started getting worse, though, and before I could even react, I felt the truck hit something hard. It wasn't just a little jolt. This was like driving off the edge of a curb at full speed. The whole cab lurched, and I was nearly thrown forward out of my seat. I managed to keep control of the wheel, but barely. The front of the truck dipped suddenly, like I had dropped into a ditch, and I could hear the tires grinding against something loose. Gravel, maybe? It all happened so fast. But when I looked up, I realized I had driven right into a section of road where the asphalt had been stripped away, like they were doing construction. There were no warning signs, no cones, no lights, nothing to indicate that the road had been torn up ahead of time. My heart was pounding. The drop-off had come out of nowhere, and now I was stuck. The front tires were deep in loose gravel, and the truck wasn't going anywhere. I tried shifting into reverse, thinking maybe I could back out of it. But the tires just spun uselessly. I was stuck alone in the middle of nowhere with no idea how to get out. I grabbed my radio to call for help, but there was no response. Cell service was spotty in that area, so I figured I'd try my phone instead. Of course, I had no signal. At that point, I realized I was going to be stuck there for a while. My immediate concern was that someone else might come speeding down the highway and hit the same drop-off, but I hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. Still, I turned on my hazard lights and tried to stay calm. The night dragged on, and as the minutes turned into hours, I started to get more and more uneasy. The road was completely deserted, and it was one of those stretches of highway where there wasn't a single light in sight. Not from buildings, not from passing cars, not even from the sky. The darkness was thick, oppressive, and I couldn't help but feel exposed sitting out there in the open. I tried to distract myself by thinking through my options. Maybe I could try walking to the nearest town, but I wasn't even sure how far away it was. Plus, leaving the truck didn't feel like the smartest idea. What if someone came by and saw the truck abandoned? Or worse, what if I ran into someone while walking alone on the side of the road in the middle of the night? Eventually, I heard the faint rumble of an engine in the distance. My first thought was relief. Finally, someone who could help. But as the sound got closer, I realized it wasn't coming from behind me, like I expected. It was coming from the direction I had been driving. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, trying to make out any lights. There was nothing. The sound of the engine grew louder, but I couldn't see anything on the road. It was just the sound of a vehicle, but no headlights, no taillights. Nothing to indicate where it was coming from. For a split second, I wondered if I was just imagining it, but the rumbling grew too loud to ignore. It sounded like a large vehicle, maybe a truck or another semi, but that made no sense. I should have been able to see it by now. I turned off the radio, hoping the silence would help me figure out where the noise was coming from. The rumbling was getting louder and louder, almost as if it was right on top of me, but there was still no sign of any vehicle. My skin prickled with unease, and for the first time, I started to feel genuinely scared. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The night fell completely silent again, and the only sound was the wind whipping through the empty plains around me. I strained to listen for any sign of the engine, but it was gone. I had no idea what to make of it. Maybe it was some kind of echo, or maybe the sound had carried over from a nearby farm or road that I couldn't see. I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting for something to happen. The truck was still stuck, and I knew it wasn't going to get out without help. Every now and then I checked my phone, but the signal was still dead. The idea of spending the whole night there started to weigh on me. I felt trapped, helpless. There was no telling when someone would come by, and I was starting to think I might be out there until morning. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of gravel crunching under tires. My heart jumped into my throat, and I snapped to attention, looking around to figure out where the sound was coming from. This time, it was clear. There was a car coming down the highway from the opposite direction. Its headlights flickered in the distance, and I felt a wave of relief. But as the car got closer, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't slowing down. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The car was heading straight for the same drop-off that had trapped my truck, and it wasn't slowing down at all. I fumbled with the door handle, ready to jump out and wave my arms to get their attention. But by the time I stepped out of the cab, it was too late. The car hit the drop-off at full speed, and for a split second it was airborne. The front end dipped violently as it came crashing back down, and I heard the sickening crunch of metal against asphalt. The car spun out of control, skidding across the gravel and coming to a stop in a cloud of dust. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run over and check on whoever was inside, but another part of me was frozen with fear. What if it was the same thing that had happened to me? What if they were just stuck like I was? But what if they were hurt? I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and jogged over to the car. The dust was still settling, and my hands were shaking as I reached for the driver's side door. The window was shattered, and the inside of the car was a mess. There was blood on the steering wheel, and the driver, a middle-aged man, was slumped over, unconscious or worse. I fumbled for my phone again, praying that I'd get a signal this time. By some miracle, I had a single bar of service. I dialed 911, my fingers trembling, and told them what had happened. The operator told me to stay on the line, but there wasn't much I could do. I tried to wake the man, but he wasn't responding. I couldn't see anyone else in the car, and I wasn't sure if it was safe to move him, so I just stayed there, waiting for help to arrive. It felt like hours before the flashing lights of an ambulance and police cars finally appeared in the distance. The paramedics rushed in, pulling the man from the wreck and loading him onto a stretcher. I tried to explain what had happened, but it all sounded so surreal. I wasn't even sure if they believed me at first, but when they saw the drop-off and the lack of any warning signs, they understood. The police asked me a few questions, but there wasn't much I could tell them. The man in the car had been lucky. He was alive, but barely. They told me that he would have been killed if he hadn't been wearing his seatbelt. They also mentioned that this wasn't the first accident that had happened on that stretch of highway. A week earlier, another driver had died in a similar crash. I stayed with the truck until a tow company arrived to pull it out of the gravel. It was nearly morning by the time they finally got me out, and I drove the rest of the way home in a daze, too tired to even think about what had happened. To this day, I still can't explain the sound of that phantom engine. A few years ago, I had a close call that still haunts me. I'm not the kind of person who usually freaks out easily, but this one shook me. It happened when I was driving through a part of town I wasn't familiar with, somewhere on the outskirts of Chicago. I was coming back from visiting some friends in the city and had decided to take a different route than usual, mostly because traffic had been crazy. And I figured I'd try to avoid the congested highways. Big mistake. The night had been going fine at first. I had my GPS on, just following the directions like I always do. I remember the route took me through some pretty rundown areas, nothing too sketchy, but definitely the kind of place you don't want to be stranded in, especially at night. It was probably around 9 or 10 p.m., so not super late, but dark enough that the streets were mostly deserted. I was driving along this stretch of road when my tire pressure light came on. At first, I didn't think too much of it. I figured maybe I'd just run over a small nail or something, and it wasn't an urgent issue. But within minutes, I started to feel the telltale wobble of a flat tire. I cursed under my breath, knowing I had to pull over and deal with it. There wasn't much around, just a few dim streetlights and some closed shops, so I drove a little farther until I found a spot that seemed somewhat safe. It was a poorly lit side street, but there were some buildings nearby, so I figured it'd be all right. I got out and checked the tire, and sure enough, it was completely flat. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of changing a tire in the dark, but I had a spare in the trunk, and had done it enough times before that I figured it wouldn't be a big deal. I grabbed the jack and the tire iron and got to work, trying to get it done as quickly as possible. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't right. It wasn't just that I was in a sketchy part of town, it was the flat tire itself. It seemed too sudden. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I'd been driving all day with no issues. And then, out of nowhere, a flat? As I was loosening the lug nuts, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 2 guys were walking down the street toward me. They weren't in a hurry, just strolling casually, but something about them put me on edge. They were heading straight for my car, not crossing the street or changing direction. I tried to focus on the tire, hoping they'd just walk past and leave me alone. They didn't. They came right up to me, and one of them asked if I needed help. I didn't want to be rude, but I was definitely getting a bad vibe from them. I told them I had it under control, but they just stood there, watching me. I could feel their eyes on me the whole time, and it made my skin crawl. The thing is, when you're in a situation like that, it's hard to know what to do. You don't want to provoke anyone, but you also don't want to show fear. So I kept working, pretending like their presence didn't bother me, but inside, my anxiety was skyrocketing. Then one of them stepped closer, offering again to help. This time there was something in his tone that really set off alarm bells. It wasn't a friendly offer, it was more like a demand. I declined again, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking, and I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was. There was no one else around, no cars passing by, no open businesses. Just me, these 2 guys, and a flat tire. That's when I noticed something shiny near the tire. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but then I realized what it was. Broken glass. There was a small pile of it right by the tire, like someone had deliberately placed it there. My heart started racing. This wasn't a random flat. Someone had set me up. They had laid the glass out on the road, hoping I'd drive over it and be forced to stop. And now here I was, exactly where they wanted me. I stood up, trying to think of a way out. I wasn't about to keep messing with the tire while these two were hovering over me. My first instinct was to just get back in the car and lock the doors, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I needed to play it cool. I told them again that I didn't need help and thanked them for stopping. They didn't move. One of the guys took another step toward me, and that's when I decided I wasn't sticking around to see what they wanted. I grabbed my tools and as calmly as possible walked back to the driver's side door. My heart was pounding, but I didn't let it show. I slid into the seat, locked the doors, and pulled out my phone. The guys were still standing there watching me, and I was pretty sure I saw one of them pull out his phone too. I called roadside assistance and explained the situation, trying to keep my voice steady. They said they'd send someone out, but it could take up to 45 minutes. I wasn't sure if I had that much time. The two guys were still hanging around, just standing there, looking at my car. I tried to act like I was busy on my phone, but I kept glancing up at them, waiting for them to leave. They didn't. They hung around for a few minutes longer, then walked a little ways down the street, out of sight but not too far. I couldn't see them anymore, but I knew they hadn't gone far. I kept my doors locked, trying to stay calm, and waited. Every little sound made me jump. I was on edge, constantly checking my mirrors, half expecting them to come back at any moment. The minutes dragged on, and I was starting to wonder if they'd given up and left for good when I saw movement again. One of the guys had come back. He was standing at the end of the street, just watching from a distance. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to get out of the car, but I also didn't want to stay parked there, vulnerable. I thought about trying to drive on the flat tire, just to get to a safer area, but I didn't want to damage my car any more than it already was. I sat there for what felt like forever, gripping the steering wheel and watching the guy, when finally I saw headlights in the distance. The tow truck. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't let my guard down. The guy at the end of the street noticed it too and quickly disappeared around the corner, out of sight. The tow truck driver pulled up, and I wasted no time jumping out of the car to meet him. I didn't mention the two guys. I just told him I had a flat and needed help getting it changed. He got to work, and the whole time I kept glancing around, expecting the two guys to come back. They didn't, though. Maybe they'd realized the tow truck was a sign that their plan had failed. Or maybe they'd just been messing with me the whole time. I don't know. And honestly, I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. Once the tire was changed, I got back in my car and drove off as quickly as I could. I didn't relax until I was well out of that neighborhood and back on the highway. Even then, I couldn't stop thinking about what had almost happened. I've heard stories of people getting set up like that, but I never thought it would happen to me. It still freaks me out when I think about it. I was lucky that night. I don't know what those guys had planned, but it wasn't anything good. They could have robbed me, hurt me, or worse. I'm just glad I trusted my gut and didn't accept their help. Since then, I've been way more cautious when driving, especially in unfamiliar areas. I make sure my car is in top shape, and I always think twice before pulling over. You never know what kind of situation you might find yourself in, and I don't plan on taking any more chances like that again. There's a part of me that wonders if they've done it before. If they've set up other drivers and had a plan for what comes next. I try not to think about it too much, but Every now and then it creeps back into my mind, especially when I'm on the road late at night, and the streets are empty. Since that night, I haven't taken any more detours through unfamiliar neighborhoods, and I always make sure to stick to well-lit areas. It's a small change, but it makes me feel a little safer. Because if there's one thing I've learned from that night, it's that you can't always trust the kindness of strangers, especially when they show up right when you don't expect them. In 2022, my girlfriend and I decided to take a weekend trip to the Smoky Mountains. We had both been stressed out with work and wanted to get away from everything for a bit. It was mid-October and the weather was perfect for a little road trip, cool, crisp air, and the leaves just starting to turn. We rented a cabin in a small town called Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It's a touristy place, but if you drive just a bit outside the main area, it gets really quiet, almost too quiet. The drive there was fine, nothing out of the ordinary. We made good time, arriving at the cabin just before sunset. The place was pretty secluded, nestled up on a hill with a view of the mountains in the distance. There wasn't much around, just a few other cabins and lots of trees. We spent the first evening relaxing, cooking dinner, and sitting out on the porch, taking in the scenery. It was one of those perfect fall nights where everything felt peaceful. The next day, we decided to explore some of the nearby mountain roads. I've always loved driving through the mountains, and the roads in the Smokies are perfect for that. Winding, steep, and full of sharp turns that keep you on your toes. We planned to drive up to Newfound Gap, which is this high mountain pass that sits on the border between Tennessee and North Carolina. The views are supposed to be amazing. We set off late in the morning. The first part of the drive was beautiful, just what you'd expect. Lots of winding roads, trees in full autumn color, and barely any traffic. But as we started climbing higher into the mountains, things took a turn for the worse. I noticed the brakes on the car weren't feeling right. They were soft, almost spongy, like they weren't responding the way they should. At first, I brushed it off. I figured it was just the mountain air or maybe the elevation change messing with the car somehow. I'd had my brakes checked before we left and everything seemed fine at the time. But the farther we went, the worse it got. We were heading up some pretty steep inclines, and I had to press the brake pedal all the way down to get any real response. Even then, it felt like the car wasn't slowing down as quickly as it should. I tried not to panic, but the feeling in my gut was telling me something was wrong. We pulled over at one of those scenic overlooks to take a break and figure out what to do. I got out and checked the brakes, but everything looked normal, at least to me. I'm not a mechanic, but nothing seemed obviously wrong. I figured maybe they were just overheating from the constant downhill pressure and hoped they'd cool off while we took in the view. We stayed at the overlook for a while, trying to enjoy the scenery and take our minds off the car, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. We had a lot more driving to do, and I wasn't sure how much worse the brakes would get. Eventually, we decided to keep going, hoping we could make it to Newfound Gap and back without any major issues. The descent started out fine, but as soon as we hit the first major downhill stretch, I knew we were in trouble. The brakes were barely working. I had to press the pedal almost to the floor just to slow down a little, and the car was picking up speed faster than I could control. Every sharp turn felt like a gamble, and there were a lot of them. Tight, blind curves with steep drop-offs on one side and solid rock walls on the other. I could feel the panic building in my chest, but I didn't want to freak out my girlfriend. I kept telling her everything was fine. Even though I was gripping the wheel so hard, my knuckles were white. My foot was shaking as I tried to keep the car from going too fast, but no matter how hard I pressed, the brakes just weren't responding. The more I tried to slow down, the more it felt like the car was fighting me. We hit a particularly steep section of road, and the car started to pick up speed fast. way faster than I was comfortable with. I tried downshifting to see if the engine could help slow us down, but it didn't make much of a difference. The car was practically flying down the road now, and I was doing everything I could just to keep it on the pavement. It didn't help that the road was narrow and full of tight turns. Each time we approached a curve, I could feel my heart race, wondering if the brakes would give out completely or if the car would just skid off the road. There was no room for error. On one side, there was a steep drop down the mountainside, and on the other, a solid rock wall. One wrong move, and we'd either crash into the rocks or go over the edge. At this point, I wasn't even trying to stop the car anymore. I was just focused on keeping it under control, steering through the curves as best I could and praying that nothing went wrong. My girlfriend had gone completely quiet, which scared me even more. I knew she was terrified, but there was nothing I could say that would make the situation any better. As we rounded one of the sharpest curves, I saw something that made my stomach drop even further. A car ahead of us, moving slowly down the road. They were probably doing the speed limit, but to us, they might as well have been standing still. I knew there was no way I could stop in time, not with the way the brakes were acting. We were closing in on them fast, and I had to make a split-second decision. Try to swerve around them or risk slamming into their rear bumper. I jerked the wheel to the right, aiming for a patch of gravel just off the side of the road. The tires skidded, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to go over the edge. But somehow, by some miracle, we managed to stay on the road. The car slid into the gravel, sending up a cloud of dust, but it finally came to a stop. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe we hadn't crashed. We sat there for a minute in silence, just trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. My girlfriend looked at me, her face pale, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I felt it too. We had come so close to disaster, and it was only by luck that we had avoided it. After a few minutes, I got out of the car and checked the brakes again. There was no sign of anything wrong, but I knew we couldn't keep going like this. We were still a long way from the bottom of the mountain, and I wasn't sure if the brakes would hold out for the rest of the drive. I thought about calling for help, but we were in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. There wasn't much we could do except try to get down the mountain as carefully as possible. We got back in the car, and I drove the rest of the way at a crawl, taking every curve as slowly as I could. The brakes were barely functioning, and every time we went downhill I had to fight to keep the car from speeding up. But somehow we made it. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, my nerves were completely shot, and I was exhausted from the stress of it all. We pulled into a gas station in the nearest town, and I checked the brakes again. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before: a small puddle of fluid under the car. I looked closer and realized it was brake fluid. Somehow, we had been driving down that mountain with a leak in the brake line, and it had only gotten worse as we went. I couldn't believe we had made it down without crashing. I didn't want to think about what could have happened if the brakes had failed completely. We could have gone off the edge of the road, or crashed into that other car, or worse. It's scary how quickly things can go wrong when you're driving, especially on roads like that. You think you're in control, but all it takes is one thing, one small failure, and everything can fall apart. We ended up getting the car towed to a nearby mechanic, and they confirmed what I had suspected. The brake lines were shot. The mechanic told me we were lucky we hadn't crashed. Apparently, the brakes had been leaking for a while, and it was only a matter of time before they failed completely. He said he'd seen it happen before, drivers losing control on mountain roads because their brakes gave out, Some of them weren't as lucky as we were. We stayed in town for another day while the car was being repaired, but the rest of the trip felt different. That sense of peace and relaxation we had been hoping for was gone. Every time I thought about getting back in the car, I felt a knot in my stomach. The idea of driving those roads again, even with the brakes fixed, made me anxious. We eventually drove back to the cabin, but we took it slow, and I avoided any steep mountain roads on the way back. Since then, I've been much more cautious about my car. I get the brakes checked regularly, and I never take chances with things like that anymore. Last year, I had an experience that still messes with me whenever I drive at night. I've always been pretty independent, and driving alone never bothered me, until this one night. I was living in Phoenix, Arizona at the time, and I used to drive a lot between cities, mostly for work or to visit family. It was one of those things that became routine. You get used to the long stretches of highway, the empty desert roads, and the feeling of isolation that comes with driving late at night. But this time something happened that I'll never forget. I had been visiting a friend in Flagstaff for the weekend and was heading back to Phoenix late on a Sunday night. It wasn't ideal, but I'd stayed longer than I planned and I didn't want to take time off work the next day. The drive from Flagstaff to Phoenix is about 2.5 hours, mostly on I-17, which cuts through the mountains and then drops into the desert. I'd driven that route dozens of times and I never thought twice about it. It was around 10 p.m. when I left Flagstaff. The weather was clear, and there wasn't much traffic, just the usual long-haul truckers and a few other cars here and there. As I got onto the highway and started making my way south, I settled into the drive, letting my mind wander like I usually did. The stretch between Flagstaff and Phoenix is pretty desolate, especially at night. There are long sections where there's nothing but dark, open space, with the mountains looming on either side. It can get pretty eerie if you think about it too much, but it never really bothered me before. About an hour into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me coming up fast. I was in the right lane, doing a little over the speed limit, so I figured it was just someone in a hurry. I didn't think much of it until the car got right up behind me and stayed there. Not tailgating exactly, but close enough that I felt uncomfortable. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but I couldn't make out much beyond the bright headlights. It was strange, though. Usually, people either pass you or keep a decent distance, especially on a highway with hardly any traffic. I kept checking my mirror, expecting the car to pass, but it didn't. It just stayed there, hovering a few car lengths behind me. After a few minutes, I started getting a little anxious. It didn't make sense for them to be so close if they weren't planning to pass. I thought about speeding up, but I was already going faster than I should have been. Plus, the road was getting into the curvier part of the mountains, and I didn't want to risk anything. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some impatient driver who didn't want to pass for whatever reason. But the longer it went on, the more uneasy I felt. The car was still there, matching my speed exactly, and I couldn't see who was driving or even what kind of car it was because of the glare from their headlights. At this point, I decided to slow down a bit, thinking maybe they'd take the hint and either pass me or back off. I eased off the gas, dropping down to about 5 miles under the speed limit. But instead of passing, the car slowed down too, staying right behind me. That's when I really started to feel nervous. There was no reason for them to be doing this. It didn't make any sense. I thought about pulling over, but we were in the middle of the mountains, and there weren't many places to stop. The next rest area was still a good 20 miles away, and the thought of pulling off the road with this car right behind me didn't sit well either. I figured my best bet was to keep going and hope they'd eventually back off. But they didn't. For the next 30 minutes, they stayed right on me, never getting closer but never backing off either. I was starting to feel trapped, like no matter what I did, they weren't going to leave me alone. My heart was racing, and my hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. I kept checking my mirrors, hoping to catch a glimpse of who was driving, but the lights were too bright. All I could see were those damn headlights, glaring at me like eyes in the dark. Finally, we came to a stretch of road where the highway flattened out a bit, and I saw a sign for a gas station coming up. It wasn't a big one, just one of those small, rundown places you find out in the middle of nowhere. Normally, I wouldn't have even thought about stopping there, but at that moment, it felt like my only option. I signaled to exit and slowed down, praying the car behind me would keep going. But when I looked in my mirror, I saw they were slowing down too. They were following me off the highway. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to keep driving, just get back on the highway and floor it. But I didn't want to lead them all the way to Phoenix. I was still miles away from any real city, and there was no way I could outrun them on these roads. I pulled into the gas station, my heart pounding, and parked right under the lights close to the entrance. The place was almost empty, just a single pickup truck parked on the side and no one in sight. I sat there for a second, watching as the car that had been following me pulled into the lot and parked a few spaces away. They didn't get out. They just sat there, their headlights still on, facing my car. I was freaking out at this point, trying to figure out what to do. My phone had barely any signal, so calling someone wasn't an option. I thought about getting out and going inside the gas station, but something about that felt wrong. I didn't want to leave my car. I didn't want to make myself vulnerable like that. Instead, I turned off the engine and locked the doors, sitting there in the dark, waiting. I kept glancing at the car, trying to see who was inside, but the windows were tinted, and I couldn't make out anything. My mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if they were waiting for me to get out? What if they were planning to follow me again once I left? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The car didn't move. Neither did I. Finally, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A man came out of the gas station, walking toward the pickup truck that was parked on the side. I don't know why, but just seeing another person there gave me some kind of reassurance. Maybe it was the thought that I wasn't completely alone. I watched as the man got into his truck and started it up, backing out of the lot and pulling onto the highway. I made a split-second decision. As soon as the truck left, I turned the key in the ignition, started my car, and pulled out of the parking spot. My plan was to follow the truck, stick close to them in case anything happened. I didn't care how fast I had to drive. I just wanted to put distance between me and the car that had been following me. I glanced in my rearview mirror as I pulled out, expecting the car to follow. But for some reason, they didn't. They stayed parked, their headlights still shining in the lot as I drove away. I didn't stop to question it. I just kept driving, sticking close to the pickup truck for as long as I could. I felt safer knowing I wasn't alone on the road, even if the driver had no idea what had been going on. For the rest of the drive, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again. But they never showed up. By the time I got back to Phoenix, my nerves were completely shot. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in my car for a few minutes, just trying to calm down. I couldn't believe what had happened. The whole thing felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Looking back, I don't know what that person's intentions were. Maybe it was just some idiot messing around, or maybe it was something worse. I'll never know. But the whole thing shook me up enough that I stopped driving long distances at night. It just wasn't worth the risk anymore. The next day, I took my car to get checked, even though nothing had gone wrong mechanically. I think I just needed the reassurance that everything was fine. But every time I get behind the wheel now, especially at night, I can't help but think about that car. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped at that gas station, or if I hadn't been able to find anyone else on the road. It's a thought that still gives me chills. Even now, a year later, I'm still paranoid when I drive alone at night. I keep an eye on every car around me, always checking my mirrors, making sure no one's following me. It's become a habit, something I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. People say that kind of stuff doesn't happen, that you're being paranoid if you think someone's following you. But I know better. It only takes one time for something to go wrong. A few years ago, I was working as a delivery driver, not for any big company like Amazon or UPS, but for a smaller local business. We delivered everything from furniture to electronics to random items people would order online. The job wasn't anything special, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. I was used to driving around different parts of the city, but this one experience stands out as something I'll never forget, and not in a good way. It was around fall, and the days were starting to get shorter. One evening, I was assigned a delivery to a part of town I didn't know too well. It wasn't super far, just one of those out-of-the-way neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city. I live in Atlanta, and if you've been around here, you know that once you get out of the more central parts of the city, it gets a little sketchy. Not necessarily dangerous, but just isolated. Lots of back roads, warehouses, and rundown buildings. That's the vibe this area had. I plugged the address into my GPS and started the drive. It was one of my last deliveries of the day, and I was eager to get it over with and head home. The directions took me through a mix of residential streets and more industrial areas, and soon I found myself in this kind of deserted part of town. The houses were farther apart, and I didn't see many people or cars on the road. By the time I was getting close to the destination, it was already dark, and there weren't many streetlights. The GPS guided me down a narrow alley. It didn't feel right, but I've delivered to some weird places before. And it wasn't the first time the GPS had taken me on a strange route. I figured it would spit me out on the other side where the address would be, so I kept driving. The alley was tight, barely wide enough for my van, and there was trash and debris scattered around. The further I went, the more I felt uneasy. But I was almost there, so I told myself to just finish the delivery and get out of there. The GPS said I had reached the location, but there was no house. No building, no driveway, nothing. Just the walls of two tall buildings on either side and a dead end straight ahead. I was confused and checked the address again, thinking maybe I typed something wrong, but it was correct. That's when I realized I had made a wrong turn somewhere, or the GPS had just completely messed up. I needed to turn around, but the alley was too narrow to make a U-turn, so I put the van in reverse and started backing up. That's when I saw them. Two cars, one from each end of the alley, had pulled up behind me, blocking both exits. At first, I thought maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were residents or workers, and I was just in their way. But then I noticed the cars weren't moving. They were just sitting there, idling with their headlights on, pointed directly at me. My stomach dropped. I knew something was wrong. I kept my hands on the wheel, not sure what to do. I couldn't go forward because of the dead end, and I couldn't go backward with both exits blocked. My van was completely trapped. The cars just sat there, their engines running, but no one got out. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could still be nothing, maybe just bad timing. But the longer they sat there, the more my anxiety spiked. After what felt like forever, the doors of both cars opened and a group of men started getting out. I don't know how many, maybe 5 or 6 between both cars. They weren't rushing or anything, they just casually got out and started walking toward my van. At that moment, my heart was pounding. It was clear they weren't there to help. I instinctively locked the doors. My brain was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could see them getting closer, talking to each other and glancing at my van. They didn't look like they were in any kind of rush, which made it even worse. The fact that they were so casual about it made my skin crawl. It was like they had done this before, like they knew exactly what they were doing and didn't expect me to fight back. I grabbed my phone and tried calling 911, but of course I had barely any signal in that part of town. The call didn't go through. I tried again, and this time it rang, but it kept cutting in and out. I didn't even know if the operator could hear me, and I definitely didn't have time to wait for help to arrive. At this point, the men were right next to the van. One of them knocked on the window, his face completely expressionless. He motioned for me to roll it down. I didn't. I just stared straight ahead, hoping they'd give up and leave. Another guy started circling around the back of the van, and I could see him checking the doors, testing to see if they were locked. My heart was racing. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The guy at the window knocked again, harder this time. I glanced at him, and he gave me this slow, unsettling grin. That's when I knew I had to get out of there no matter what. I wasn't waiting around to see what they were planning. I shifted the van into drive and floored it. The alley was tight, and I wasn't sure if I'd make it past the cars, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to sit there and wait for whatever was about to happen. The van lurched forward, tires screeching as I slammed on the gas. One of the men jumped back, clearly not expecting me to make a move, but I didn't stop. The van sideswiped one of the cars, scraping along the side as I squeezed past. I heard the sound of metal grinding, but I didn't care. I just kept going, praying I wouldn't get stuck or hit something that would stop me. I could see them in the mirror, running after the van, shouting something, but I didn't stick around to hear what they had to say. Once I was clear of the alley, I sped down the road, not even checking if they were following me. I didn't slow down until I was several miles away, back in a part of town that felt safer. My heart was still pounding and my hands were shaking on the wheel. I pulled into a gas station, parked the van, and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. I checked my phone again, and this time I had a signal. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them. I didn't have any clear description of the men, and I wasn't even sure where I had been exactly. It all happened so fast. Plus, I was still in shock and just wanted to get home, so I didn't call. I just sat there trying to process what had happened. The van had a long scratch down the side from where I'd scraped the car, but other than that, it was fine. I was lucky I got out of there when I did. If I had waited even a minute longer, who knows what could have happened. I didn't want to think about it. Eventually, I pulled myself together and drove home. The whole way, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting those cars to show up behind me. They didn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they could have followed me if they wanted to. I spent the rest of the night feeling on edge, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I reported the incident to my boss, but I left out some details. I didn't want to seem paranoid or make a big deal out of it. I just told him the GPS took me to a bad part of town, and I had to take a detour to get out. He didn't ask many questions, just told me to be more careful next time. I didn't tell anyone else about it either. It felt too surreal, like something out of a movie or a bad dream. But it was real, and it still makes me uneasy every time I think about it. I've read stories about delivery drivers being targeted like that, but I never thought it would happen to me. You think you're just out there doing your job, minding your own business, and then something like that happens and it changes the way you see everything. You realize how quickly things can go wrong, how vulnerable you really are when you're out there alone, especially at night. I was living in a small apartment complex in Denver when this happened, working long hours and trying to balance a pretty hectic life. The complex itself wasn't anything special, just a typical cookie-cutter apartment building. My unit was on the ground floor, tucked away in the back of the complex. So I didn't have much foot traffic going by. It was a quiet spot, and I liked it for that reason. Not a lot of people bothered me, and I could come and go as I pleased without running into too many neighbors. One night after a long shift, I got home late. I was dead tired, the kind of exhaustion that hits you when you've been on your feet for hours and just want to crash. It was probably around 9 p.m. when I pulled into the parking lot. I always made a habit of locking my car right when I got out. Just a simple click of the key fob, and I'd hear the reassuring sound of the doors locking behind me. That night was no different. I locked the car, slung my bag over my shoulder, and headed inside without a second thought. The next morning I had an early shift, so I didn't have much time to think about anything else besides getting out the door and making it to work on time. But when I went to my car, something weird caught my eye. All the doors were unlocked. Now I know I locked them the night before. I'm obsessive about it, especially in the city. I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought last night and just forgot. But that didn't seem right. I checked the car over, expecting to find something missing, but everything was exactly where I'd left it. My wallet was still in the center console, and nothing looked disturbed. It didn't make any sense, but since I was in a rush, I brushed it off. I locked the doors again, double-checking this time, and drove to work. The whole day, it kind of bugged me though. The idea that I might have left the car unlocked didn't sit right. But what else could it have been? No signs of a break-in, no broken windows, just unlocked doors. By the time I finished my shift and got home that evening, I'd convinced myself it was just a fluke. Things were fine for a few days after that. I was busy with work and life, and the weird car incident faded into the background. But then, about a week later, the same thing happened again. I came out to my car in the morning, and the doors were unlocked. This time I knew for a fact I hadn't forgotten. I'd made sure to lock it the night before, hearing the click and seeing the lights flash as I walked away. And yet, here I was again with an unlocked car. I felt uneasy, but I didn't want to let it get to me. Maybe my key fob was malfunctioning, or maybe I accidentally hit the unlock button without realizing it. I tried to think of any explanation that didn't involve someone messing with my car. Again, nothing was missing. It was like whoever, or whatever, unlocked it didn't even go through my stuff. After that, I started being extra careful. I'd lock my car, then pull on the handles to double-check it was secure. I even started parking in a different spot, thinking maybe someone in the complex had figured out how to mess with my locks somehow. For a while, everything seemed normal. Weeks went by without any incidents, and I started to relax, thinking maybe it really had been some weird technical issue with the key fob after all. But then one night, I came home from work late again. It had been a rough day, and I was more exhausted than usual. I parked, locked the car, checking the doors like I'd gotten into the habit of doing, and went inside. I didn't even think about the weird stuff from before. I just wanted to collapse into bed and forget about the day. The next morning, when I went out to my car, everything seemed fine at first. The doors were still locked, and nothing looked out of place. But when I got in and sat down, something felt off. It took me a second to realize what it was. The interior light was on. Not the dome light that turns on when you open the door, but the little light in the back seat. I hadn't turned it on, and I rarely even sat in the back seat, so there was no reason for it to be on. I turned it off and sat there for a moment trying to make sense of it. Could I have accidentally bumped it somehow? Maybe it had been on for days and I just didn't notice. But I would have seen it before, especially at night when I was parking. My mind started racing with all sorts of explanations, none of them comforting. I decided to check the car again, more thoroughly this time. Maybe something was missing after all, and I just hadn't noticed before. I went through every compartment, checked under the seats, looked in the glove box. Everything was where it should be. But then, as I was getting ready to give up and head to work, I noticed something small and crumpled on the passenger seat floor. A piece of paper, folded up and stuck under the seat. I hadn't put it there, and it definitely hadn't been there before. My heart was pounding as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a small, plain piece of paper, no bigger than a sticky note, with a single sentence scribbled on it in messy handwriting. "I'll be back when you aren't in such a rush." I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I stared at the note. Someone had been in my car. Someone had been unlocking it, maybe even watching me, this whole time. And they'd left this message, like it was some kind of game. I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching me, but it was empty. Just the usual line of parked cars with no sign of anything unusual. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing with questions. How had they gotten in? Why hadn't they taken anything? And how long had they been doing this? I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? There were no signs of a break-in, and nothing was stolen. Just an unlocked car and a creepy note. I felt stupid, like no one would believe me, so I didn't call. I just locked the car again, made sure it was secure, and went to work, trying to put it out of my mind. But the note stayed with me. Every time I got into my car after that, I was paranoid. I started checking the back seat before I got in just in case. I'd double, sometimes triple check the locks, pulling on the doors and making sure the lights were off before I left. I even started parking in different spots again, thinking maybe it would throw them off. For a while, nothing happened. No more unlocked doors, no more strange lights, no more notes. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on, maybe gotten bored and left me alone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I started looking out my window at night, checking the parking lot to see if anything seemed out of place. I never saw anything, but that didn't make me feel any better. One night after another long day at work, I came home late again. I was tired, but my guard was still up. I parked, locked the car, pulling on the door to make sure it was locked, and went inside. I had a routine by this point: get home, check the car, make sure everything was in order, and then go inside. I was exhausted, but I couldn't let my guard down. The next morning I came out to my car, and everything seemed fine again. The doors were locked, the interior lights were off, and nothing was missing. But when I opened the door and got in, I noticed something small stuck to the windshield on the inside. Another note. My heart dropped. I pulled it off the glass, my hands shaking as I unfolded it. It was the same messy handwriting as before, and it was just one sentence again. "You're not as careful as you think." That was it for me. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care what anyone thought. I knew someone was messing with me, and I couldn't take it anymore. That same day, I started looking for a new place to live. I didn't even want to wait around to see what would happen next. I couldn't live like that, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when they'd come back. I moved out of that apartment a few weeks later, and I never looked back. I never found out who was doing it or how they were getting into my car. Maybe they had some kind of key or device that could unlock it without setting off the alarm. Or maybe they were just watching, waiting for the right moment when I let my guard down. Either way, I couldn't stay there any longer. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.